In November 1956, the world quietly crossed a line that could never be uncrossed again, and almost no one noticed at the time because there were no parades, no surrender ceremonies, no ruined capitals, only a telephone ringing in London carrying a message that would end centuries of power. Britain had ruled oceans, drawn borders, controlled trade routes, commanded currencies, and shaped the destiny of nations, yet in less than 2 weeks that authority evaporated, not because of battlefield defeat but because the foundations underneath it had already rotted away for decades, and on that day reality finally demanded payment. The British Empire believed itself eternal because it had always survived every storm before, and that belief was its greatest weakness, for empires do not collapse when they are attacked, they collapse when they refuse to see themselves clearly, and long before Suez, Britain had already lost the war. It simply had not yet received the bill to understand how this moment unfolded. We must travel back not to 1956 but to the long confident century before it, when Britain stood unmatched astride the world like a colossus. Its factories powered the industrial age, its ships filled every major harbour, its bankers decided who lived and who starved, and the British pound became more than money, it became trust itself. Nations accepted it not because Britain forced them to, but because stability seemed baked into its very existence. British power was not loud, it was assumed, and when power becomes assumed, arrogance quietly follows, because no one plans for a future where they are no longer necessary, and beneath the smokestacks and shipyards a dangerous illusion took hold that British dominance was not the result of specific conditions but a natural law of history, something ordained by destiny rather than earned through effort and innovation. Visual description: a realistic cinematic black and white photograph showing a vast 19th century harbour filled with steam-powered ships bearing British flags, warehouses stretching endlessly along the shoreline, workers frozen in motion as smoke rises into a pale sky, symbolising industrial dominance and quiet confidence. Britain grew wealthy not only by producing goods, but by controlling how goods moved and how money flowed. The pound sat at the centre of global finance, allowing Britain to borrow cheaply, spend freely, and fight wars without immediate consequence. This privilege created habits, and habits became expectations. Britain expected to spend more than it produced, expected to maintain global commitments regardless of cost, expected the world to adjust around it rather than the other way around, and for a long time it worked because alternatives were weak and competitors were distant. But history is never static, and across the Atlantic a restless nation was growing faster, stronger, and more efficient than Britain could imagine. The United States surged ahead in production, population, and innovation, yet Britain dismissed this rise as temporary because the empire still looked impressive on maps and its currency still ruled trade. Visual description: a slow-moving cinematic shot of an antique world map illuminated by soft light, British territories glowing, while a faint outline of the American continent grows brighter in the background, hinting at an approaching shift. The First World War shattered the illusion without destroying it completely. Britain emerged victorious, but victory came at an unbearable cost, borrowing heavily, draining manpower, and selling assets to survive. And when the guns fell silent, Britain was no longer the banker of the world, it was deeply in debt, especially to the United States. Yet rather than recalibrate its ambitions, Britain chose denial. Leaders convinced themselves that prestige could replace productivity and reputation could substitute for balance sheets. They restored old systems, pretended old hierarchies still applied, and punished their own economy to maintain the appearance of strength. High interest rates crushed growth, unemployment soared, exports collapsed, yet military bases remained, empire commitments remained, and spending continued because admitting decline felt more dangerous than ignoring it. Visual description: a detailed historical reenactment style image of weary factory workers standing outside closed mills as suited officials walked past carrying ledgers symbolizing economic strain beneath political denial. Even when reality forced humiliations, Britain still clung to its role by binding colonies into a financial web, forcing them to hold pounds, ensuring demand artificially. But coercion is not confidence, and when World War II erupted, Britain repeated the same pattern on an even larger scale, borrowing staggering sums, fighting bravely, and winning alongside allies, yet emerging economically exhausted. By 1945, Britain survived only because America allowed it to survive. Loans, patience, and political goodwill kept the empire breathing, but survival is not strength and dependence is not power. Yet British leaders refused to see the difference. They spoke the language of greatness while operating on borrowed lifelines, maintaining armies, fleets, and influence they could no longer fund organically, and this slow motion collapse led directly to Suez. Visual description: a sambar cinematic black and white image of bomb-scarred London streets transitioning into polished government halls, showing contrast between sacrifice and stubborn ambition. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain interpreted it not as a regional dispute, but as a challenge to identity. The canal was a symbol of imperial authority, oil access, and relevance, and losing it meant admitting the world had changed. So Britain acted as it always had, with forced confidence and allies believing success on the ground would Secure respect abroad and militarily, it worked. British forces advanced quickly, yet the battlefield no longer decided empire's finance did, and Washington understood this better than London. President Eisenhower saw the invasion not as strength but as recklessness threatening global stability and American interests, and he chose to end it without firing a shot. Visual description: a tense cinematic shot of a dimly lit room with a telephone at the center, shadowed figures around it conveying silent power and unseen pressure. The ultimatum was simple and devastating: stop or lose everything. The United States would sell pounds, flood markets, block loans, and let the British economy collapse. Britain watched its reserves drain at terrifying speed. Days from catastrophe, the choice was illusion or survival, and survival meant surrender. Eden ordered withdrawal, and in that instant the empire ended, not formally, not ceremonially, but psychologically. Britain obeyed because it had no alternative. The creditor had spoken, and the debtor complied. Suez lasted 11 days, but revealed a truth decades in the making. Britain was no longer a superpower, it was a nation living beyond its means, sustained by memory and debt, and when the debt was called, the memory evaporated. Visual description: a slow fading image of British soldiers boarding ships as flags lower quietly under a grey sky, symbolizing retreat without defeat. What makes this story unsettling is not British failure, but its familiarity. The same patterns, the same confidence, the same assumptions now define America: debt, rising production, declining military commitments, expanding currency dominance relied upon rather than defended. America, like Britain, believes history protects it, that its role is permanent, that demand for its currency is guaranteed, but reserve currencies do not fall gradually, they fall suddenly when trust breaks, when alternatives appear, and when creditors decide. Reputation is no longer enough. Britain learned this in 11 days. America may learn it just as fast, and as the clock moves toward the mid-21st century, the parallels grow impossible to ignore: debt, accelerating interest payments, rising production, moving elsewhere, military spending unmatched yet unfunded organically, and a belief that being American exempts the nation from mathematics. Britain believed the same until November 1956, and history does not forgive denial, it only waits until the lesson is unavoidable. This concludes as Britain absorbed the shock of Suez. Something subtle but irreversible happened inside its leadership and its people. The realization settled in that power once lost cannot be commanded back through pride or nostalgia. The empire still existed on paper for a few more years, but everyone who mattered understood the truth: the world had moved on and Britain would now follow rather than lead. The illusion of choice had vanished, replaced by adaptation, and retrenchment. Budgets were cut, bases closed. Influence narrowed, and the pound slowly surrendered its role to the dollar, not through dramatic collapse but through quiet acceptance. Britain survived because it adjusted, but it never ruled again, and that is the part of the story most often misunderstood. Collapse does not always mean ruin, it means the end of unquestioned authority, the end of shaping outcomes alone, and the beginning of living within limits. Visual description: a realistic cinematic black and white photograph showing empty imperial offices, desks cleared, maps rolled away. Sunlight falling on dust particles, symbolizing the quiet aftermath of lost power across the Atlantic. America now stands where Britain once stood, at the center of trade, finance, and security. Trusted because it has always been trusted, relied upon because it has always been relied upon, yet beneath that confidence lie familiar warning signs: debt growing faster than output, interest consuming resources, production shifting overseas, and global partners exploring alternatives not out of hostility but out of prudence. Trust is never permanent, it must be earned continuously through discipline, stability, and realism. Britain assumed trust was inherited, America risks assuming the same, and when trust erodes it does not announce itself with alarms, it slips away quietly until one day it is gone. Visual description: a slow-moving cinematic shot of global trade routes fading and reappearing in different patterns, suggesting subtle shifts beneath the surface. The danger is not that America will disappear or fall into chaos, the danger is sudden adjustment, a moment when constraints assert themselves faster than systems can respond, when a crisis forces choices that were postponed for decades. Britain did not plan for Suez, it stumbled into it believing control still existed until it did not. America faces similar inflection points, financial, geopolitical, and social, where leverage may be tested and assumptions challenged. Reserve currency status is not revoked by vote, it is abandoned by use, and the moment alternatives become convenient, confidence evaporates faster than policy can react. Visual description: a detailed historical reenactment style image of ledgers closing while new ones open, symbolizing transition rather than destruction. History does not condemn America to repeat Britain's fate, but it does demand humility, awareness, and preparation. Britain ignored its internal warnings, dismissed critics, and clung to image until reality intervened. America still has time to choose differently, to invest in production rather than consumption, to align commitments with capacity, to rebuild credibility through restraint rather than force. But time narrows quietly, not loudly, and the longer denial persists, the harsher the correction becomes. Britain lost its empire in 11 days because it spent Decades refusing to imagine Los Americas moment may come through a different trigger, but the lesson remains unchanged. Power that depends on belief alone is fragile. Power grounded in reality endures. Visual description, a final cinematic black and white image of a horizon at dawn, light breaking slowly, suggesting uncertainty but also possibility. The fall of British dominance was not destiny, it was consequence shaped by choices, habits, and refusals to adapt, and the same truth applies now. History offers warning, not prophecy, and whether America listens will determine not if it survives but how it lives after its own illusions are tested, because empires do not end when others rise, they end when they forget what made them strong, and that is the quiet lesson Suez left behind.